I'm the interim director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the lecture by Dr. Tom Smith on Antisemitism in Contemporary America. Before we speak about what is happening here in this country and the disturbing timeliness of this topic, I would like to draw your attention to the historical context in which we initially planned this lecture. This lecture is our annual Kristallnacht commemoration. 80 years ago, on November 9th and 10th, 1938, the Nazi German government orchestrated the systematic destruction of Jewish houses of worship and community centers throughout Germany and Austria. Shops and businesses of Jewish owners were destroyed and looted. Countless German Jews were beaten, many beaten to death, and about 30,000 Jewish men arrested and deported to concentration camps. The attacks were perpetrated by the SS and the Gestapo, but not exclusively by these notorious units. They were also carried out by local police and in collaboration with firefighters who were instructed to keep the flames of the burning synagogues from reaching the property of non-Jewish neighbors. All of this would not have been possible without the open or implicit consent of the majority of the German and Austrian population who stood by and watched as these crimes were committed and the genocide unfolded. We have the great privilege today that we are joined by Professor Hans Laufer, who kindly agreed to share with us his memories of Kristallnacht and how he experienced the pogrom and its aftermath. Hans Laufer has been professor of molecular and cell biology at UConn since 1965. He received his PhD from Cornell University in 1959 and had a postdoctoral fellowship from the National Research Council. His research foci include comparative endocrinology of invertebrates and the development of crustacean aquaculture techniques. He has close to 200 publications, a sample of which you can find on his website. Please join me in welcoming Professor Laufer.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Anyway, I was 9 years old. I just turned 9 years old in October. And in November, I remember Kristallnacht. And the way it happened to me was I was in my bedroom at 2 o'clock in the morning, and a bathroom, a washing plunger they don't make them anymore, but they were used for, instead of washing machines, they used washing plungers, and they threw this plunger through my window. And that was the only damage that our family actually experienced. It happened to have been my bedroom. The other Jewish families, however, for example, I recognized the plunger as coming from this dry goods store, which was down the street. And we visited, the next day, we visited this dry goods store, and the place was destroyed. It was unbelievable. It was just a wreck. And down the block was the temple, and the temple was burned to the ground. I remember all of this. And the Germans said this was a popular uprising and that it was organized by the people. But my experience was that years later, I was in a Jewish museum in Prague, and they had 100 temple the Torah curtains, 100 of them piled up. So the only way they could have accumulated 100 Torah curtains is to have looted the temples before they burned them, and they must have taken all the jewelry, all the Torah decorations, and all of that out of the temples before they burned them. So this was a really highly organized phenomenon. The other thing that I remember is that my father was arrested that day and he had to report to the police station until actually, ultimately, about a month later, he was sent to a concentration camp. The other thing, of course, was it was my last school day. I was not allowed to go to school that day, the next day on the November 10th. And the other thing is, I had violin lessons as a child, and my violin lessons stopped. And I had Jewish Hebrew lessons, and the Jewish teacher who came from out of town obviously wasn't allowed to travel. He was probably arrested too, and he couldn't make it. So our whole life really turned upside down from that day. And it really made an impression on us. And we were lucky enough, my father had come to the United States during the summer to make arrangements for our visas. And we left Germany a few months, actually. We left Germany in January of the next year, and we arrived here in March. We stopped in Holland and England, and we came over here. And we came as a family. We left all of our possessions were left there. We arrived with $16 in our pocket, and my father had to pay a taxi cab with that $16 to get from the boat to Manhattan, in New York. And we lived in New York, and I grew up there. So those are my memories, and I think it was a highly organized phenomenon that involved, as we just heard, that everybody was involved in this uprising, not just a popular uprising. Thank you.
Thank you. The murder of 11 congregants at a Shabbat service at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh made many of us think of the events of 1938 and the long history of anti-Semitic attacks and persecution and discrimination of Jews throughout the ages. The attack in Pittsburgh, as well as the recent racially motivated murders of 2 African Americans at a grocery store in Jeffersontown, Kentucky, are part of a larger climate of fear-mongering and hatred. And we see it as part of our mission to confront anti-Semitism, racism, and hatred of refugees and migrants and build a more just, equitable, inclusive, and peaceful society. This lecture, which is co-sponsored by the Francis and Irving Seliger Memorial Endowment Fund, the American Studies Program, the Humanities Institute, the Department of Literature, Cultures, and Languages, and the Thomas J. Dodd Research Center, is a part of this mission. Now, before I hand over to founding director of our center, Professor Arnie Deshevsky, to introduce our speaker, I want to take the opportunity to acknowledge a few people in the audience. From among the core faculty of Judaic Studies here, we have Professor Stuart Miller here, the academic director. Among the longtime supporters of the center are Stuart and Joan Seliger Sidney, who established in memory of Francis and Irving Seliger the Memorial Endowment Fund to support and reward students for academic work related to the Holocaust, as well as to support programming related to the Holocaust. And you find more information about Irving and Francis Seliger in the program. They left Poland in 1938 and came to the U.S. In 1941 as refugees. And their story really inspired Joan Seliger Sidney's poetry. Joan is also a writer-in-residence, poet-in-residence here in our center. Other longtime supporters that we have in the audience here are Fred and Eileen Stern and Arnie and Sandy Deshevsky. We're so grateful for your help in sustaining our work. I also want to thank Pam Weathers, Matt Perrin, and Kezia Mann for their work in making this event here happen. And now I'm delighted that Professor Arnie Deshevsky, who has a long-standing working relationship with Dr. Tom Smith, agreed to introduce our speaker.
I want some show and tell along just for this introduction, just very briefly. But I am delighted to welcome back to UConn Dr. Tom Smith, who's been a frequent visitor here to our campus because he served for many years on the board of the Roper Center, which was located here at UConn for quite a number of years. And today he is reprising a role that he played, and this is quite remarkable, exactly 20 years ago, virtually to the day, when he came here to talk about the state of contemporary American anti-Semitism, Monday, November 9th, 1998. Unfortunately, we have a great archives here at UConn, and this is the original flyer that, that we put out for Tom. Now, see, it got more sophisticated. This is the one we have now. And I only wish that we would have a picture of Tom here, because I said earlier today, it would show how gracefully he's aged in the 20 years. So as was noted, Kristallnacht, the night of the shattered glass, occurred November 9th and 10th, 1938. And I invited Tom then to launch the first UConn commemoration on the 60th anniversary of that tragic event, because he had recently published an article on contemporary anti-Semitism. And I just discovered this, Tom, I was telling you, that in class today we're introducing theories of anti-Semitism. And I gave these students, my students, an article to read about a survey that was sponsored by the American Jewish Committee, and it was titled, You Just Can't Trust Those Wissians. And I tried to show how illogical and irrational prejudice is. Wissians, 39% of the sample didn't like Wissians, but Wissians are an invented group. In any event, the reason I'm mentioning this to you, I didn't remember this, but it said that the study of anti-Semitism done in the early 90s, the author was Tom Smith. So Tom has a long history of working on the topic of anti-Semitism, and that's why I and my co-editor of the American Jewish Yearbook asked Tom to undertake an article on anti-Semitism in contemporary America, which will appear in the 2018 issue of the American Jewish Yearbook. And in the back, there's out in the lobby, there's a flyer about that forthcoming issue. By the way, I brought this along as show and tell. This is the original 1899 issue of the American Jewish Yearbook. Kind of looks like a prayer book you might find in a synagogue. And since it's been edited here and at the University of Miami, it looks more like this, a little thicker. But in both cases, it still represents a kind of statistical and social portrait of American Jews. And I might just share with you how many Jews they had an estimate lived in Connecticut in 1899, and the estimate was 6,000. And how many Jews lived in Florida in 1899? And today it's over 100,000 Jews in Connecticut. In 1899, there were 2,500 Jews in Florida. Today there are over 600,000 Jews. Anyhow, I think needless to say, the horrific events of the murder of 11 Jews in the synagogue on Shabbat morning about 10 days ago in Pittsburgh, something I'm labeling the Pittsburgh pogrom, are a stark reminder of the extent to which anti-Semitism still remains a social problem in the United States. For those of you who are not familiar with Tom, he is the director of the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago's Center for the Study of Politics and Society. And since 1980, he served as the director of the General Social Survey, which is one of the most visible projects that the National Opinion Research Center sponsors, and one of the nation's most heavily utilized data sets, usually done every 2 years, a representative sample of about 2,500 respondents. He was the first recipient at National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago's Norman Bradburg Career Achievement Award, and was recently elected to the Sociological Research Association and Honor Society of Leading Sociological Scholars. So let's give Tom a warm welcome as he talks to us about anti-Semitism in contemporary America.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the center for inviting me here. I'm deeply honored to be able to come here and talk to you about the topic of anti-Semitism. I'm going to start by showing some, as it says, there's some trends, and then I'll go into some other issues about this. I've picked as simply some examples of trends in behaviors and trends in attitudes. There's many more data in the annual Jewish yearbook that in the chapter that will be appearing in that shortly. So here's the first item. This is an item goes all the way back to the 1930s. Most recent reading in 2015. Willingness to vote for a Jewish person for president there. It starts out with the majority not willing to vote for that. You see the numbers steadily going up, and by the time you get to the late 1980s, 1990s, essentially 90% of Americans said they'd be willing to vote. So this is an example of increasing acceptance in American life, in this case, political life, of Jews. This is the most frequently used measure of anti-Semitism in surveys. This is been asked on a number of surveys by the American Anti-Defamation, the Anti-Defamation League, and there's 11 items. They all, as you can see there, are stereotypical views about Jews and either their contributions or their lack of contribution to America. And this was originally part of a larger study that was carried out in 1964 for the ADL by NORC. And they developed these items from that study and have been using it ever since. This shows the trend. In this case, the way they describe the trend is how many people of those 11 mentioned 6 or more anti-Semitic statements. That is what they define as someone who is anti-Semitic. And you see there that the numbers start in 64 with just under 30%. The numbers go down into the 90s. But then somewhat an interesting thing happens. If you look at the last half dozen points, there really is no further trend there. They've gone down, and then they're just kind of going up and down a little bit with no clear direction anymore there. So a big decline, but not a further recent decline in anti-Semitism by that measure. Here's 2 other closely related ones. The Pew Center asked this about whether you are, how favorable are you to your opinion of Jews? Very favorable, so on. This is the percent saying they very and most are somewhat favorable. 2 things there. The overall percentages are quite high. You get essentially between 70 and nearly 90% of people saying they have these favorable views. But in the shorter period that this is covered, from the beginning of this century down to 2011, there's no trend there. Good, high, favorable ratings, but no real trend there. This is a survey that the American Jewish Committee commissions, asking only Jewish respondents, do you think anti-Semitism is currently a very serious problem, somewhat serious, so on. This is the proportion saying it's a very serious problem. In 98, you see 35%, it kind of goes up and down. But until the last term, it tends to be going down overall, but then you see a big surge in 2017. That is, you can see if you look over the whole series, that change from 16 to 17 is the biggest shift in the entire period here. A big increase and a record high, although just a little bit higher than it was at a couple earlier points, but the highest it's been recorded. So that's a little flavor of the attitudes here, and here's some figures on behaviors. This is the ADL's audit of anti-Semitic incidents here. It started in the early 80s. Goes down, it surges, you reach the high point in the mid-90s. It basically works its way down to a low point in 2013, and then it starts moving back up. And I only show this through 2016. We'll talk about 2017 a little bit later there. But the beginning of a reversal after the record low point. This is a count of incidents reported to the ADL by people who observed or experienced these. This is not a survey, this is not a census count of this. This is self-reports of experiences or observations of these types of incidents. This is what the FBI does. They have a count as part of their uniform crime reporting of hate crimes. The top one shows the number of hate crimes. Basically, this is with any group, a racial group, a religious group, an ethnic group, a gender orientation group in which there's been hate crimes committed against them. The numbers are tending to go down here, as you can see. And the lower number is the number of those hate crimes which were directed against Jews. So, of course, the total number is all different groups, and, of course, that number is a little better. The number there is relatively low. It's on the order of 1,000 to several hundred being reported. This is reported, crimes being reported to the police, which are then judged to be hate crimes. And in the case of the lower number, hate crimes involving Jews being the target of those crimes. Very flat, as you can see, and actually a slight decline there through 2016. Now, we're going to shift back here for a minute and look about one attitude. I showed you that 11-item scale, and I showed you that it had been showing decline over time, although not in the last 20 years, but major declines before that point. This is one of the components of this, and this is a very special component of it. This is essentially those who believe that Jews are more loyal to Israel than they are to America. Okay, this is what's called dual loyalty issue here. Now, if you look at the very first point, you see it back in 1964, 30%. And if you look at the most recent point, 2016 there, 30%. Of all 11 measures in the classic ADL scale, this is the only one that does not show decline. On average, there's been some up and down the middle, and matter of fact, all that kind of going up and down the middle is because I've included a couple closely related but not identical measures. And a lot of that bounces because some of the question wordings, I'll just skip ahead and show you them. Different question wordings here that lead to a little bit different results. But the big upshot here is this is the one exceptional item that does not show a clear decline. All the other stereotypes about Jews do show declines. But in this one, it starts and ends at the same point, with a non-trivial, nearly a third of Americans endorsing the idea that Jews are more loyal to Israel than to America. Now, this has an unfortunate, very worrying tie-in to what happened at the Tree of Life synagogue. Now, we all know, and it's very clear from the person's past expressions, we have this very adamant anti-Semite. But one of the main themes that he talked about in his ravings were the Jews were aiding all these illegal immigrants coming into the country. This is another way of questioning the loyalty of Jews, just like the traditional question that this is shown, Jews are more loyal to Israel than the United States. And while Jews are wanting to let all these outsiders in, they're not standing up for America, they're trying to take and weaken America by letting illegal things, by supporting the caravan and so on, according to the terrorists who killed the 11 in the synagogue. This raises the possibility, and there is some data that could be analyzed, but it hasn't been because it's not in the public domain, that perhaps we need to think about a new anti-Semitism. Now, this is a phrase that's been around a long time. I've traced back usages in the United States to the first decade of the last century, 1910. And in Great Britain, the phrase was being used as early as the 1920s. And people mean different things by new anti-Semitism over time. The possibility here is that there's a new anti-Semitism which is de-emphasizing some of the traditional stereotype by Jews, but giving greater emphasis to the questionable loyalty. That Jews are part of the other, they're not part of us, they're not patriotic, they subvert the central images of America. And the thing that we have, it's been one of these measures of this 11-item scale, but what we don't know is whether its influence within that scale has changed, because the detailed items on the scale are not publicly accessible for analysis. So that's something I think we need to very seriously think about, is to understanding where the motivations and the specific anti-Semitic claims have substantially changed in America in recent decades. Now, there are some analysis which actually points to some promising, or let's say, encouraging signs. One of the things we looked at in the report was, what about trigger events? Now, trigger events would be an event that is, and you'll see what I mean when I give this specific example, which are causing some serious disruptions, some serious problem in America, and which are tied to classic anti-Semitic beliefs about Jews. Now, the first one involves Jonathan Pollard, who was convicted for spying for Israel. And this, of course, feeds into the dual loyalty and not being good patriotic Americans. We were able to look at a number of questions right around when he was arrested, when he was tried, when he was convicted, and there was no sign of that triggering more anti-Semitism in general, nor more support for this dual loyalty item. So here's the classic thing that one could have said should have been a trigger event to give a upshot of anti-Semitism. Didn't occur. The second example is a combination of the Great Recession, which of course is tied to finances, and of course goes into the old trope about Jewish bankers and controlling the world and all that. And according to, of course, the Ponzi scheme of Madoff, both one being revealed, happening for decades, at the same point in time. Fortunately, there were a couple of very good studies that examined both the general impact of the Great Recession and specifically Madoff, the impact. Neither shows any uptick in anti-Semitism because of the two together or each of them separately. So again, these two classic trigger events, which one might have well predicted, there are other trigger events that occur that we don't have a lot of good data around, but none of them really seem to have encouraged that either. Now, I want to talk in a little depth about the situation of the last couple of years. And I'm going to read you some survey results verbatim, because I really want to get the exact question very forward. So there has been some, there's the question as what has been the cause of in the ADL audit in 2017, which showed a huge increase in reported incidents. And of course, the horrific anti-Jewish slurs at the Charlottesville protest and riot. And most of the popular, when I say popular, I mean things that have been mentioned in the media for the cause for these both strong signs of increased anti-Semitism, are related to the candidacy and or presidency of Donald Trump. And some of the main things that have been mentioned are as follows. These are the connections that a number of writers have seen. Mostly journalists, but also what some organized Jewish groups have mentioned. One, the connection is the rise of white nationalism, wanting to make America great again. That this buying into white nationalism has increased the hatred. The association with and the expression of support for the alt-right. We can think of this, and particularly when Bannon was in the White House. 3, the political attacks on minorities in general and immigrants in particular. 4, ignoring or downplaying acts of anti-Semitism and group hatred and bigotry in general. And 5, the coarseness and negativity of the political rhetoric that's been used by the president as candidate and as president. Now, it's very difficult to take and test all these, but what we do have is some surveys which ask people questions related to these connections. And so what I can tell you is what the American people think the connections are. So I'm going to read you the first question here. This was asked, most of these polls were asked about the time of Charlottesville. The first question, do you think that President Donald Trump's decisions and behavior as president have encouraged the white supremacist groups, discouraged white supremacist groups, or do you think his behavior and decisions have had no impact either way? So what do American people think? Well, 59% said his rhetoric and actions have encouraged white supremacists. 3% said it's discouraged them. I don't know what planet they're from. And 35% believe it hasn't had an impact one way or another. So clearly the American people, the substantial majority, believe there is this connection. Now, of those who did see Donald Trump, the 59%, the majority did see his rhetoric and actions as encouraging white supremacists. They were then asked, do you think President Trump has deliberately encouraged these groups, or do you think the president has accidentally encouraged these groups? Of those who say that he's encouraged them, 61% say deliberate, 33% accidental, and 7% don't know. So majority of people believe there's this connection, and they believe it's a deliberate connection, not an accidental connection. The limitations for our purpose here today of those two questions is they're simply talking about white supremacists, and not specifically against anti-Semitism or attacks directed towards Jews. We believe that there is a connection there, that it would be much better if we had actual questions about do you think Donald Trump had promoted anti-Semitism, do you think that was intentional, and so on. But it feeds into the possibility that anti-Semitism has also, that the American people would also judge that. I'll read you one last question here, also done about the same time. Do you yourself think it is acceptable or unacceptable to hold neo-Nazi or white supremacist views Do you feel this way strongly or only somewhat? So 3% of Americans found it such views, holding of such views to be strongly acceptable. 5% somewhat acceptable. It rounds up to actually 9% if you collapse them together. 11% holding these views as somewhat unacceptable, and 72% strongly unacceptable. Now, there's a couple ways to look at that. By far, the largest number says very unacceptable to hold these views. If 9% of the American people said it was either somewhat or very strongly acceptable to hold these views, represent people who were also sympathetic for those views. 9% is a very scary number. You think what one deranged person did in Pittsburgh, 9% were Americans. Now, a limitation of this question is it does not rule out the possibility that a fair number of these people are taking the Voltairean position that all views should have a right to be held and expressed, no matter how hateful they might be. And we don't know. There's not a follow-up question about sympathy for these groups. We do have some information from a study that the Southern Poverty Law Center does. They do a count. They've done a count since 2000 of the number of extremist groups. Now, this is not public opinion. This is not even the size of the groups, but just how many groups in different categories there are. And their categories are Ku Klux Klan groups, neo-Nazi groups, racist kinship groups, Christian identity groups, black separatist groups, neo-Confederate groups, white nationalist groups, and in just the last couple of years only, anti-LGBT groups and anti-Muslim groups. There's no real time series on the last two. The figures clearly show that in terms of the number of neo-Nazi groups, they made up 30% in the early years, 30% of all the hate groups that they were counting. And in the most recent year, 2017, made up only 13% of hate groups. And this shows a fairly steady decline of that. The group that they showed the largest increase from 8% up to 24% was black separatist groups. So the group that's most clearly identified as anti-Semitic, neo-Nazis, is not increasing its number of groups. On the other hand, however, all these other groups don't think kindly about Jews. Ku Klux Klan, the Christian identity movement, the white nationalist movement, they are not friends of the Jewish community. So the fact that the one that's most notoriously anti-Semitic has shown fewer groups is not as encouraging as one might think that it should be. So the last thing that I'll take and say is when studying anti-Semitism as an attitude, as a thought pattern, there's been the concern, particularly when the number of people endorsing stereotypical views of Jews, negative views of Jews, was going down in the 60s, 70s into the 90s when, as I say, it's leveled off, that this was really, people were just hiding their anti-Semitism. That either hidden anti-Semitism was occurring, or something that's not quite as dangerous as hidden. Hidden means that you are very clearly still think these negative views of Jews, but for strategic reasons you don't want to admit it. That's hidden. The second one is latent anti-Semitism. Latent anti-Semitism is, no, you're not going actively day in and day out thinking anti-Semitic thoughts, but there are things in your experience, things in your consciousness that can be triggered, that can bring it out. There are very few studies that really try and test this. There are some very good social science techniques, and I'll just mention three of the more well-established ones, in which you can take and dig down, take and try and measure both the hidden and the latent anti-Semitism. One is called factorial vignettes. You take and describe a situation, you randomly vary characteristics of people in the story. You take and describe people as men or women, old or young, Jewish or not Jewish, either directly or by implying Jewishness through some information. This was what was done with one of the stories about Madoff. They described him as a American financier, as a Jewish American financier, or as a financier who supported Jewish charities. It's a kind of in-between way of marking it. And it showed that people who got the version that mentioned his Jewishness, either directly or indirectly, were no more upset and did not want a greater punishment of Madoff for his crimes. This approach can be used in a much more elaborate fashion. It can help to tease out crime. It's been well documented. It can take and show otherwise not disclosed racism, antisemitism, sexism, and so on. Another one is something called the implicit association test, which basically, if you're very quickly shown either pictures or names of terms, it goes so fast that if you're shown positive terms and the name of the group, and you click on the positive word, then that shows that you have positive things. If negative one shows up, the quicker you click on either positive or negative shows this, and it goes by so fast that you can't thoughtfully go and disguise what you're doing. This is your immediate, here's a group, here's a term. So it might be greet, it might be Jews greeting, or it might be blacks athletic, whatever. And it goes very fast. You go through a lot of these, a lot of different groups, a lot of different terms, and this can be is measured in milliseconds to take and capture the hidden or the label. And then there are what's called matched pair studies. There was one actually done in Connecticut in which resumes were sent out for businesses. The businesses were advertising, and a study was done sending out resumes, and they were randomly varied on whether the resume disclosed the applicant was Jewish or not Jewish. And at least in this study of those companies in Connecticut, there was nothing that showed greater discrimination against candidates who were applicants for the job who were identified as Jewish and those who weren't identified. So no indication of that. All these techniques need to be used a lot more to they can really find out how much of this. So what's the bottom line? A long-term improvement in terms of less prejudice, not a lot of improvement in recent decades. Jewish groups, if you ask questions in which you evaluate various minority groups, different religions, different ethnic groups, different racial groups, the positive views of Jews are among the highest, and the negative views of Jews compared with these other groups, not that you're comparing this group with Jews, that group with Jews, but all of them are being compared, like how trustworthy is this group? How would you react to a member of this group being a neighbor? Jewish ranks very high in terms of the positive and very low in terms of negative assessments there. So that is a good sign. The American public clearly believes that the rhetoric and actions of the Trump administration don't have stirred up things regarding bigotry, and we really need questions that specifically explore whether they believe that's true specifically for anti-Semitism, that is of course, the thing that in the day, we have an interesting juxtaposition of two things which happened, which is it coincidence or is it a telling thing? We have one very unfortunately unsuccessful thing. I think we're up to the 16 bombs that were sent through the mail to people that are the short list of every organization or person that Donald Trump hates in America. I mean, the fingerprint there is clearly this person was picking exactly the individuals and groups that Donald Trump had picked. And this is, of course, immediately followed by the Tree of Life massacre then. And are these connected in some way? I think that there's the same turmoil and upshot of bigotry in America that's driving both of them, or not. It's very hard to say, but one has to take and worry about bigotry against immigrants, bigotry against racial groups, bigotry against religious groups such as Jews, tend to be more tied together than they do to be independent of one another. So that's what I have to say.
So thank you very much. We have time for some questions. We have a microphone. Yeah. So while we're waiting for the microphone, I also want to acknowledge the directors of the co-sponsoring centers. I didn't do that in introduction. I should have done it. So there's Chris Weil of the American Studies Program, Glenn Mitoma of the Dodd Center, and Kathleen Olival of the Human Rights Institute. So thank you for your co-sponsorship. And now we have time for questions.
Maybe if the students have questions, they could ask first. Some of my students here are from the sociology of anti-Semitism, so I want to be sure they got a chance to ask any questions.
Well, I'll even extend the invitation to comments you want to make, too.
I'll ask a question.
All right.
I'm not at a loss for words.
Okay, so thank you very much for reviewing your very comprehensive article that's coming out in the American Jewish Yearbook. We're looking forward to that. So we're in a situation now where, according to the Pew Research Center and also what you alluded to, Jews are the most warmly regarded religious group in the country, according to the Pew Research Center. And even more so if you separate out the Jews who voted for themselves in these probability sample surveys and the evangelicals and the Catholics who were closest to the Jews, the gap is even greater. And yet, we have these horrific acts that are occurring at a very time when anti-Semitism is at a relatively low level, despite the fact that you accumulate a lot of millions of people. And I wondered how we might be able to explain that. It's something I'm dealing with in my course. So I thought perhaps you might have something to say about that.
Yeah, so on one level, it's easy to explain in the sense that mass opinions of the general public do not have to be synced up with any particular terrorist act or any particular radical group. These can happen independent of the general climate. The fear is, of course, if the climate is turning less supportive, that it may encourage more of these. Matter of fact, if you take the groups that have, or take examples of mass shootings, which clearly the Tree of Life incident qualifies among the dozen or 15 most deadly mass shootings in this century. Many of them are tied to, that has no social basis for it. The Sandy Hook massacre of the children. That's the deranged act of that one person. Now it is, and the still completely unexplained attack in Las Vegas, in which no known motivation for that gentleman to kill 50-some there. However, it is interesting if you look at the much smaller number of mass shootings involving churches. There's only been 4 in this century. 3 of them are clearly directed against a minority group. The one in South Carolina against blacks, a Baptist church, which one would believe blacks rather than Baptists were probably the target. The Tree of Life against Jews, and a killing of, I think it was 5 or 6 Sikhs in a Sikh temple in Wisconsin. So those do tend to be more tied to hate crimes in which there are organized groups. Well, the Sikhs get in trouble because the very ill-informed people believe the Sikhs look like Muslims. It happened right after 9/11. Several Sikhs were attacked for being Muslim, which they're not. But even in the church things, so 3 of the 4, and I left out one, and that is the most deadly church shooting, which was the one in Texas, which was triggered by a family dispute. And the person that this deranged person was after was the family member that he was out to get, wasn't even in church that day, and killed 27, I think it was, in there. So even there, of course, not all church shootings are that, but they do tend to be much more, they're not just inexplicable school shootings, which were many of the ones. There's just some teenager or some college student just goes out and decides to shoot everyone up in his school or on his campus. But these ones, the ones that relate to religious institutions do tend to be ones that do tie into more generalized group hatred and not just the individual acts of the deranged person, although I believe it's fair to say that they also do involve the deranged person. So the real fear is, though, that people, and perhaps a good example is the male, the one who sent bombs to the mail. There's every reason to believe, because of his targets, he was inspired by the targets that Donald Trump was mentioned. And that's something that one really has to worry about, whether people will be either individuals or groups will be motivated by, well, yeah, I can go and attack immigrants, the president's against immigrants, or I can go attack whatever the group is. It might be because they're seen as a threat, or they're seen as not real Americans. So that's the threat, that this can just stoke this more. And again, with the Tree of Life, the references in the tweets to the immigrants, and that it does show some connection. They are not as clear as a fingerprint as the bombings through the mail was. But there's a tie-in to anti-immigrant sentiment being expressed and targeting the group not only because they were Jewish, but because they were perceived as encouraging the influx of the illegal immigrants.
I have a question.
So you're talking about some of the worst acts, these are murders, mass murders. What trends do you see in like desecration of synagogues, of just anti-Semitic acts that don't lead to murder? And what are the trends around that, and how should we be concerned about that at this time?
So the ADL numbers have shot up, and there's one unfortunate, very major complication. In early 17, until he was arrested in Israel, a very large number of threats against Jewish centers were made by this American-Israeli teenager in Israel. And if you take out the minimum estimate of how many he directly was the source of, you reduce the increase from roughly 50% to only 30%. It's not clear that they identified all that he was the source of, so that's an uncertainty. And the second uncertainty is whether this huge surge of, by one court estimate in Florida, of over 200 of these in the first 3 months of 2017, encouraged a lot of other people to report real threats. The ones that they wouldn't have report, but they were, that, oh, this is happening, I got to report this thing that might have gone by. So in other words, they could have had a spillover. What is very interesting is there was a lot of concern that right after the Charlottesville and the vicious anti-Semitic slurs and that was brought out during that protest in March, that there was going to be another big surge. And, it would encourage people to do that. But in the 2 quarters, in the ADL estimate right after Charlottesville, they didn't see a surge in that thing. The numbers were high for the year as a whole, but that event in Charlottesville did not trigger a increase in anti-Semitic reports. But they are definitely up. It's really muddied by this very large impact of this person from Israel who he was arrested, and I'm not sure just where the trial situation. He was arrested for crimes in Israel for doing this,
Professor Smith, thank you for speaking today. A colleague of yours at UC, David Nierenberg, has made a very persuasive case for the use of the term anti-Judaism in his recent book on the history of anti-Judaism. Based on your studies of opinion, do you think the term anti-Judaism will ever become part of the discourse about hatred against Jews that, as Professor Nierenberg has shown, has existed continuously since ancient times, regardless of trends? It's always there. Do you see this term as ever becoming part of the discussion about the issue?
So that's very interesting. The term anti-Semitism is deeply entrenched in the both formal use by organizations and in the general vocabulary as the term that's used. If you look at the history of it, it's somewhat odd. Jews are not the only Semites, and in that sense it's imprecise, but it has developed in actuality a precise meaning. The main, besides the entrenchment of the existing term, the main reason why I would think that the anti-Judaism might have an uphill struggle is that many of traditional stereotypes about Jews are more in the commercial and financial area and not innately part of Hebrew teachings as a religion. So there is this clearly Jews as a religious group, but also Jews as an economic group and a social group and so on. And Judaism, anti-Judaism seems to want to talk about the term to me, to my ear, implies only the ritual aspects of being Jewish. And I think that might be a reason why it also might have trouble gaining ground. Terms do change. I've written papers on terms about changing racial terms in the United States. And so back in the 19th century, people who I will take into people of African ancestry were known as colored. And then they became known as Negro. And then in the 60s, they became known as black. And you can document over time how these terms dramatically changed in their usage over time. And then Jesse Jackson in particular in the 80s promoted the term African American. And it's the only one that didn't actually replace the older term. It's kind of coexist. Blacks are still, the term black is still very commonly used, but African American, and so they kind of coexist now. perhaps that could happen with anti-Judaism. Maybe it could coexist with that. Because this is one clear example where terms have very much changed. Now, we've almost gone full cycle because we now have, again, people of ancestry in Africa were called colored people in the 19th century. But now we have people of color, but it's broader, you see. It's not just people from Africa. It is a much broader term than what the term colored meant 150 years ago. So that word has come back, but it has a broader meaning than it has. So now, things do change. Maybe in this case. I'll write a best-selling book with it in the title, and that will help. Yeah.
Well, as we're moving toward the end, I thought maybe there would be a way to end on a more upbeat note. From your research on this topic, which goes back 30, 40 years, do you see any factors that can contribute to a lessening of anti-Semitism? It's kind of a question I think my students will be asking me before the semester ends, and I wonder if you had any comment on that.
Well, in the aftermath of the horrific slaughter, I was very happy to see how many ecumenical movements there were, particularly the encouragement of non-Jews to go to synagogues on the following Sabbath, and the number of people going, and the other ecumenical demonstrations in support of the Jewish community, I found as very encouraging, and did take and try and did point out what I believe is a fact, that people with strong anti-Semitic feeling are a small minority, and the message of support came across in my own estimation. You know, one must do a serious study of it, just how many, and there's of course survey data just being collected. There hasn't been enough collected yet to take and measure questions about solidarity and support for the Jewish community in the aftermath. I hope they will be as positive as I think they will be. So that's the encouraging thing, that I think there was a strong citizen level, not just organized response by, Catholic clergy or by interfaith ecumenical groups, but individuals. Pretty strong nationwide support expressing their sympathy for and support for the Jewish community in the aftermath of this horrific occurrence.
So if there are no more urgent questions, then please join us outside for a reception. That may also be another opportunity to ask questions individually to our speaker. I want to thank you all, and most of all, I would like to thank Dr. Tom Smith again.